Yeah. See, working for you, brother. I got you double salary.
All right.
2 times 0 is 0. I love it.
Yeah. And I can divide by 0. No, I can't. No.
Yeah, I'm gonna work. Next week I'll try to double your salary.
Okay, yeah. Just keep
Hey,
doubling it.
I'm that way. I guess you just think about it, brother. I love it.
I appreciate it.
We pray for Mary Ann.
Well, good morning. Come on in and find a spot. Ooh, the echo is nice on that. In case y'all are wondering, that's how it sounds like I don't miss any notes. So just gotta fake it till you make it. But we're glad y'all are here this morning. We gave the band the week off, so they are probably sleeping in. That's what I would be doing if I had the week off. But we hope y'all had a great week. We're getting close to Thanksgiving and Christmas, which is a great thing to celebrate. Finding a sense of normalcy in this year. We are glad you're here. Go ahead and stand with us as we worship this morning.
White
power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand till he returns or calls me home. And here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Sing that again, no power. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Let's do that one more time. I'm going to hop off the mic and just sing this as a congregation. Let's raise our voices and proclaim this truth. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Y'all may be seated. Let's pray this morning. Father, we just come before you, thanking you for this truth, for this hope. Lord, we pray for all those that are dealing with COVID, that you give them strength and healing. Lord, we pray for Austin, that you would speak through him to us today, Jesus. That your message would be heard. We ask this in Jesus' name.
Good morning, everybody.
Okay, so I wanted to let you guys know, when I talked to Mike the other day, everybody's talking more recently than that, but he and Connie are doing well, mild symptoms, headache, fever in the evening time, but overall doing really well, so that's good. Just keep praying for them and lifting them up. Also, you may have noticed out front there is a
Pop-up surprise auction. When we were here yesterday, we found several items that we don't really want to store for a whole year because we're trying to cut down on what we have, but it's a nice thing. So if you want to buy any of that stuff out there, it's there. It's just kind of a silent auction. Just sign up for whatever you want and then take it because we don't want it here anymore. If you have to pay me next week, that's fine, but take it today. So you can look on your bulletin. You can see there's no kids classes or youth next Wednesday, which is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, but they will still have prayer, so if you want to come for that, but there won't be any youth or kids because of different people traveling and stuff for Thanksgiving. And on December 5th, Lord willing that we're still holding out and we haven't been had to shut down anymore for COVID or anything like that, we're going to have the ladies are going to have an ornament exchange. And that's going to be here on December 5th at 10 a.m. And you can get with Rory or myself for more details. And during that same time frame, we're going to do the kids and youth are going to do like a cookie decorating and ornament making time. So if you want to drop your kids off for that, or you want to come, the ladies, if you want to do the ornament exchange and then bring your kids for that. So, and the rest you can look on. We have a potluck December 13th. And we didn't get to do our Thanksgiving dinner, and I was so sad about that. So I'm really hoping the Christmas potluck is going to be big and nice and lots of fun. So y'all join us for that. I'll have a sign up next week for that so we can know who's bringing what and all that stuff. So thanks.
Hello? All right, I'm live. We can hear me. Good morning, everybody. So, as y'all have been told so far, I get to preach today. My apologies. Bear with me. We'll make it through this together. It'll be okay. Mike had actually planned on being out of town this Sunday anyway, before getting sick and all of that. So I had a little more notice than Josh did, not just because I had an extra week, but I had several weeks. So apologies for Josh having to do it so last minute when I had so much ample time. So much so that I actually bounced around a few different ideas for several different lessons, different passages, trying to figure out what to teach over, right? I mean, I had all sorts of different songs would play, and I would be in the car, and I would be like, oh, this would make a great sermon, and then another song would play, and I'd be like, oh, this would be a great sermon, so much so that I really couldn't figure out what to teach over today for the longest time. But a few weeks ago, Mike had brought up a point that really stuck with me these past couple weeks as I've been trying to figure out what to preach over, and that was that the fight we have is not a fight of flesh and blood. It is a spiritual battle that all of us are going through day in and day out. And so as I thought about that and the different possibilities for the different lessons that I could have come up with, eventually I came upon a decision, and you guys will hear that today. Maybe, if I can manage to get it out. So we're going to go ahead and be in 2 Kings chapter 6, if you want to turn there, while I give a little bit of background on how I came about this particular passage. Most of the time when we discuss the whole battle of spiritual, not flesh and blood, we look at Ephesians, right? The whole armor of God. You have to wear spiritual armor if you're in a spiritual battle. And while that is very, very important and very crucial, it's also a little bit overdone, if I can say. I mean, no passage is overdone, obviously, but that's what everyone immediately goes to. And for anyone who has been to any of the times I've taught the youth, you know that I don't like to do your typical lessons. Any of the passages that are preached over often are typically the ones that I avoid. I like to look at the Bible and go through passages that aren't preached over a whole lot. And so I came to 2 Kings chapter 6 and realized that in this passage, Elisha realizes that it's a spiritual battle. And he fights the spiritual battle unlike any other spiritual battle or flesh and blood battle pretty much through the entire Bible. He does something that not many people would have done or would have even thought to have done. So we'll be going through that passage today. I'm going to go ahead and open with a word of prayer. Hopefully everybody's gotten there by now. So if you'll close your eyes and bow your heads with me as we pray. Dear God, I thank you for this day that you've given us today. I thank you for the word that you've given to me. I ask that you can help me to deliver it and that the congregation will hear your message that you've taught me and that they will leave today changed by your word and that they will be able to go into the community around us and to show them what they have learned today. We thank you for the health that we have. We thank you for those that are not with us, that for the most part they are fairly well in their illness, and we thank you because it could be much worse. And we just ask that you be with the nation as we go through quite a trying time as the world deals with this pandemic. It never seems to stop. This year has been quite interesting. So we just ask that you help us to continue on and to look into your word and to grow in our relationship with you. In your name we pray. Amen. So the title of my message today is Open Your Eyes. If you know this passage, then you'll understand why. We're going to read through the entire passage, but first, in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 17, Elisha prays for his servant's eyes to be opened. That's where the whole theme of this message comes from, is from that verse. And his servant wasn't blind. He didn't ask God to restore his servant's sight because his servant couldn't see the physical world. his servant couldn't see the angels that were surrounding them, which is a very spiritual matter because it is a spiritual battle that is really going on. And so, as we go through this passage, I want us to keep in mind that the fight that we see as we look out into this room, as we see other people, as we go through our day and we go to stores and we see other people, or we look on Facebook and we see other people's posts, the things that we see are not really the things we're fighting. It's the things that we don't see. And Elisha prays that his servant will see the things that you normally cannot see. And so that is the whole idea behind my sermon today. Like I said, we're going to go ahead and read through, starting in verse 8 all the way through verse 23, just to read it over to give you the big story, and then we'll go through and break it down verse by verse. Starting in verse 8. I'm on a slightly different version than Cade. One of these days we're going to get him the version that everybody uses, and it'll be great. But he got the closest thing he could get. Verse 8, it says, "Once when the king of Syria was warring against Israel, he took counsel with his servants, saying, 'At such and such a place shall be my camp.' But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, 'Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are going down there.' And the king of Israel sent to the place about which the man of God told him. Thus he used to warn him, so that he saved himself there more than once or twice. And the mind of the king of Syria was greatly troubled because of this thing, and he called his servants and said to them, 'Will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel?' And one of his servants said, 'None, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom.' And he said, 'Go and see where he is, that I may send and seize him.' It was told him, 'Behold, he is in Dothan.' So he sent their horses and chariots and a great army, and they came by night and surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And the servant said, 'Alas, my master, what shall we do?' He said, 'Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them.' Then Elisha prayed and said, 'O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see.' So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, 'Please strike this people with blindness.' So he struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. And Elisha said to them, 'This is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek.' And he led them to Samaria. As soon as they entered Samaria, Elisha said, 'O Lord, open the eyes of these men, that they may see.' So the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. As soon as the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, 'My father, shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down?' He answered, 'You shall not strike them down. Would you strike down those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master.' So he prepared for them a great feast, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. And the Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel." It's a long passage to read. So, that is the entirety of the story. We see Elisha prophesying, preventing his king from being killed. The Syrian king obviously did not like this because he was trying to kill him, and he was very confused by this. We then see a lot of events unfold. We'll go through them in detail. Now, I want to go back to verse 8. Like I said, we'll go through piece by piece. This is how I typically do my sermons. I know a lot of people do them differently. I like to just go verse by verse and break it down. We're going to go through verses 8 through 10. I'll read them again, and then we'll take a deeper look at what's really going on here. Verse 8, it says, "Once when the king of Syria was warring against Israel, He took counsel with his servants, saying, At such and such a place shall be my camp. But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, Beware that you do not pass this place, for the Syrians are going down there. And the king of Israel sent to the place about which the man of God told him. Thus he used to warn him, so that he saved himself there more than once or twice. So, as we see in the beginning here, we have the Syrian king plotting to kill the Israelite king. And on more than one occasion, more than two occasions, he fails to assassinate him, basically, with him setting up these camps and trying to get the jump on this Israelite king. And you got to admit, if you were that Syrian king, this would be quite annoying, right? I mean, nowadays, we know ambushes are set up in war all of the time. And if every time you set up an ambush, it's not working, that's going to be aggravating. And you're going to assume, as the Syrian king assumed, that there is a spy in your midst. And so, as we go through our day, we don't know what people are planning. Just like the Israelite king wouldn't have known what the Syrian king was planning had Elisha not told him. As we go through, we don't see what's going on around the world other than what's in our lives. We only know what we're told, and we only know what we see. And so the Syrian king could not wrap his hand around how on earth was the Israelite king getting away from him every single time. And I think that it's really vital that we understand we don't know what's going to happen 5 minutes from now. We don't know if when we leave out of this parking lot today, if we're going to make it home. We all hope we do, but we don't know. However, God does know. God told Elisha what the Syrian king was planning. And that's the only way that we can know what's going to happen, is if God tells us and we listen to him. If the Israelite king had not listened to Elisha, would he have made it past the first strike? Probably not. I mean, we can't say for sure, but most likely if he had not listened to the direction God had given him, he wouldn't have made it to round 2. And so, firstly, we have to listen to what it is that God says that we need to be doing. We will continue on to verse 11. And it says, And in the mind of the king of Syria was greatly troubled because of this thing, and he called his servants and said to them, Will you not show me who of us is for the king of Israel? Goes back to the whole, he assumed somebody was a spy, because that's the only way intelligence gets leaked. However, the Syrian king was looking at a physical battle. He was looking at a worldly battle where he only saw those that were in the room with him. He saw his trusted counsel, the ones that he told his plans to, and he said, one of you has to be the one that's ratting me out. Because in his worldly mind, that was the only possibility. And we have two options here. We can either act like the world, or we can act like a Christian should, and we could follow Christ's example. He assumes that one of his men have betrayed him. But his men, or at least one of his men, knew better. And in verse 12, we see that it says, And one of his servants said, None, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedroom. So this one servant understands it's not that there's a spy here in the midst, it's that this prophet Elisha knows what you're telling everybody in secret. He's not there, he's not sneaking into there somehow so that he can run back to the king and give him his information, but he is being told what you say in secret. And that goes to prove a point just because someone is lost does not mean that they can't see God's work. They may not fully understand it, but they can still see what's happening. This man understood that Elisha had the intel. He just didn't really understand how Elisha was getting the intel. We have to understand sometimes that when it comes to this battle of flesh and blood that so many people try to wage, it's not our battle. So often, the lost even look at us and say, look, this is not the battle that we should be having. That servant understood the king is going to try and find out who the spy is, and he's going to keep interrogating or killing until he finds out who it is. But that wasn't the case because it was a spiritual matter. So we continue on to verse 13, and we get the king's reaction. The king obviously trusted this servant because he didn't hesitate, he didn't question. He probably already had the suspicion that Elisha was the one that was giving the clues away. Elisha did have a little bit of a reputation. So he responds in verse 13 by saying, "Go and see where he is, that I may send and seize him." And it was told him, "Behold, he is in Dothan." And I find it very interesting that he has been trying and trying to set up an ambush for the Israelite king and failing because Elisha knew ahead of time. So his response is to set up an ambush for Elisha, because that's going to work so much better, right? I mean, obviously, if Elisha knows what you're going to do before you do it, then just ambush him and he won't see it coming. That's the only logical thing to do. And it really goes to show that the Syrian king only saw the physical fight, the flesh and blood fight. He could not wrap his head around the fact that there were bigger things at play here. He knew that Elisha was considered a prophet. He just didn't believe in the God that Elisha did. And that's what made the difference. More than just sending out people to find him, though, he wanted him seized. He wanted him brought to him, possibly for interrogation, possibly for execution. Elisha was not loved by foreign kings, I will say. But he never really got that opportunity. So in verse 14, we see that the king sends horses and chariots and a great army, and they came by night and surrounded the city. I also would like to point out that his tactics probably haven't changed very much. He's still sending army and chariots and horses and all of that. But I do find it really interesting that his goal here is to capture one man. And so he sends an entire army to go capture this one man. It says a lot of things, but we're going to stick with the fact that this one man is causing this king quite the problem for him to send an entire army just to capture him. I mean, that's a lot of resources, right? You got to think, these men are not just going next door. Like, he's sending an army to this city. There's horses, there's chariots, there's a lot of people. That's a lot of food, that's a lot of time. I mean, you're moving all of this stuff to go and capture Elisha. He was willing to sacrifice a lot of resources to silence Elisha. And that is something that, while he looked at it on the physical flesh and blood world, is really applicable to the spiritual world. Right? Because Satan is so willing to spend all the resources he can to silence those that are speaking on God's behalf. We, as Christians, have to listen to God in order to avoid being caught. And I think it is crucial that we understand that an army is by no means a small amount, right? He was sending an entire army after one person. And I cannot emphasize that enough because of God's response to that, which we'll get to here in a second. In verse 15, we continue on. I'm trying to keep my notes up with where I am because I get ahead. In verse 15, we see it says, "When the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And the servant said, Alas, my master, what shall we do?" And again, I would like to point out a lot of things in this verse, because we see that the servant of the man of God arose. So Elisha is there with his servant, and his servant is the one who walks out and sees the army. Which means that Elisha, who is on a good connection with God and clearly talks with God plenty, is soundly asleep, not worried about anything. I don't know about you guys, but typically in high-stress times, it's hard to sleep, right? It's hard to get a good, comfortable sleep when you're under a lot of stress, when you're under a lot of pressure, when you don't know what's happening next. I get the impression here that Elisha was not stressed or worried or anything like that. He was probably pretty relaxed. However, his servant was not. His servant was up early and was, at this point, terrified. And it again goes to show that we can look at things from a physical, what's right in front of us point, or we can look at things from a spiritual point. This servant knew what Elisha was capable of. He knew who Elisha was, obviously. But this servant did not have the faith that Elisha had. And that is an important thing to take note of. You cannot live off of someone else's faith. It doesn't matter how close you are, how good of friends you are, how much time you spend with them. You have to have your own faith. You're not able to be calm in the storm because you're with so-and-so who is a spiritual giant. If you do not have God with you, then you will not be calm in the storm. However, I will point out the servant does make one really, really good move. Right? He gets up early, he goes out, he sees the army, and the first thing he does is goes to Elisha and says, "What are we going to do?" A lot of people in that predicament would probably just run or try to find out what they're going to do to themselves. But he did make the right move in going to the man of God that he knew better than he did, and asked him what he should do. And that's something that a lot of us could probably learn from as well, is that in times of crisis, go to the most spiritual person you know before you decide what you're going to do. In verse 16, we get Elisha's response, which is pretty standard. Do not be afraid. I mean, how many times do we see that phrase in the Bible? Do not be afraid. It's repeated over and over and over again because, let's face it, if we see something in front of us that's scary, we become afraid. Elisha understood, though, what was in front of him was physical. And he knew that the spiritual was more than that. He understood that there was no reason to be afraid because, yeah, there's danger right in front of him, but he has the Lord of Lords with him. And so because of that, he had no reason to be afraid in the midst of danger. And he says, do not be afraid for, which is basically because, those who are with us are more than those who are with them. I find that wording very interesting. Maybe it's just me. But typically, I would say something along the lines of, we outnumber them, not those that are with us are more than those that are with them. That implies that there are those with them. Right? Even if it was the fact that there's angels on Elisha's side, right? He would still have only said, those that are with us are more than them, not those with them. And so it implies that while Elisha knows that God is there and God is going to protect him, Elisha also knows that that army is not there just because that Syrian king said to go get him. Elisha knows that the Syrian king is just a pawn in the grand scheme of things. When we look at it from a spiritual point of view, we understand that the people at play are just pawns in a game. And Elisha has no hard feelings towards this army or towards the Syrian king. He's more concerned with those that are with them. And when you look at it from that point of view, it changes things. That's how he can look at that army and say, no, we're not going to hurt these men. These men don't even understand what they're doing. They don't understand who's really controlling them. And he wants to instead help set them free. We continue on from that verse, and we see in verse 17, Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Personally, I would love to see this picture. I mean, that would be an amazing thing to see. I mean, our greatest movies come nothing in comparison to that sight. Doesn't matter how grand, it could be Marvel or DC or whatever giant movie company has the greatest CGI effects in the world, and it will still pale in comparison to this sight of just mountain covered by the Lord's army. Which brings me back to my point earlier of how the Syrian king was willing to send out an army just for Elisha. And he sent out a large army. They surrounded the city. They were probably quite capable men. And the Syrian king did spend a lot of resources to try and capture Elisha. But God has innumerable resources. And he's willing to send much more than anyone else could possibly send to defend that one person. And so that is something that we need to also keep in mind as we go through and disaster strikes and hardship comes and we don't understand what's going on. It doesn't matter how much someone's trying to drag you down. God has the resources to bring you up much more than you can be dragged down. On top of that, I would like to point out that this army of angels with the chariots of fire and the horses and all of this stuff don't actually do anything in this passage, do they? They're just there for show. God sends them as a comfort. They don't fight this other army. There's no need to. God has other ways around that. He simply sends all of these resources not to protect Elisha, but to comfort Elisha. You see, it's one thing to say, I will protect you by giving you $1 million. But it's another thing to say, I'm going to give you $1 million just so that you can live comfortably for the rest of your life. They're very different. If you were to say that all of our soldiers that are over in the Middle East or wherever they're fighting are doing it so that we can have softer chairs, are we going to think that that's a worthy sacrifice? No. But God is willing to send all of those angels to fight so that we can have softer chairs. In a spiritual sense, not literally. We don't need softer chairs, they're fine. So we continue on, and we see in verse 18 how blind the Syrians really are. It says, and when the Syrians came down against him, because they did not see this other army. Their eyes were still closed. And so they came down. Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, please strike this people with blindness. So he struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. I don't find it a coincidence that the servant's eyes were opened and the Syrian's eyes were closed. In case you haven't picked up on the theme today, it's seeing that things are not just flesh and blood. If you cannot see the spiritual, you might as well not see the flesh and blood. If you don't understand the bigger picture of what's going on, then just don't take part in the fight. That's the best thing you can do. And I also find it interesting that it specifically says that they were struck with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. If Elisha hadn't asked for them to go blind, God probably would have just used the army that was there to do what it was there to do. But Elisha wanted to spare those people. Elisha understood that no one is too far from redemption. It doesn't matter if they're coming for your life. There is still hope for them. And that hope is not won by fighting them with a sword or a fist or a word. It's by showing them love and compassion. And that is what Elisha ends up doing. And I want us to think about how often we see people come and attack us, and we only see them, and so we just fight back immediately, instead of opening our eyes to see the spiritual that's going on in order to be able to fight the spiritual. Because we always talk about having the spiritual armor of God, and we always talk about making sure we fight with God's word and stuff like that. But if we don't open our eyes to see the spiritual fight that's going on, we can never fight that fight. I don't know if any of you have ever tried, and I don't recommend it, but fighting blindfolded, it's going to end badly. I mean, if you cannot see who you're fighting, you'll never win the fight. And so we really have to open our eyes and see the spiritual going on in order to fight the right person, because it's not those that are in front of us. And so we continue on, and we see that Elisha blinds them, but not just so that he blinds them. In verse 19 it says, and Elisha said to them, this is not the way. You could take that a lot of different ways. I'm just going to leave it at that. And he says, this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. And he led them to Samaria. Now, I don't know if you guys know this or not, but the Syrians are not in control of Samaria. There's a lot of different geography and wars, and this is in 2 Kings and stuff, so there's constantly people taking land and losing land and stuff like that. And I know that because when they open their eyes in Samaria, the Israelite king is there. And so that would mean that he probably is ruling over that area at this time. And so we see in verse 20, they enter Samaria, and Elisha opens their eyes so that they may see. He blinds them so that he can take them somewhere else and open their eyes. Seems a little counterproductive because all he did was move them. He's still there with them, which means if their goal is to capture him, they could still do that. Except for he took them somewhere that was outside of their comfort zone. He took them somewhere that they didn't belong, somewhere that they no longer felt so charged and so ready to attack. He took them to a place where they would stop and listen to what he had to say, where he was able to show them the love and the compassion that God commands us to show them. Instead of fighting them and then showing them the love, he stops the fight altogether walks away from it, and then shows them the love. And that's something that we all need to try and be better at, because so often it's easy to put up your guard and to fight them off, and then to try and go back and reconcile and show them love then. And it's a lot easier if we just show them love from the beginning. We see in verse 21, it says, "As soon as the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, 'My father, shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down?'" Kind of the same situation as with the servant. He doesn't exactly understand what's going on here. He sees Elisha coming in, being followed by this Syrian army, and he's like, "Do we kill him? What do we do?" And of course, Elisha tells him not to, but it goes back to the whole, if you don't see the spiritual battle going on, you will always fight the wrong enemy. At this point, the people following Elisha don't mean him any harm. They don't know he's Elisha at this point because they're blind. And so they're just following this man that they think is going to take him to Elisha. And the Israelite king immediately goes on the offense and says, "Do we kill him?" Because he only sees what's right in front of him. Elisha answers in verse 22, and he says, "You shall not strike them down. Would you strike them down, those whom you've taken captive with your sword and with your bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master." Elisha says, look, if you took them in captive from a battle, would you bring them here just to kill them? No. I mean, if you're bringing in slaves, it's not to kill them. If you'd done that on the battlefield, if you're going to. I brought them here so that you could feed them, give them some water, it's been a long journey, and then send them home. Not exactly how you would expect to win a fight, right? If an army comes to capture you, typically setting up a feast for them is not how you would win that fight. They'd come in, take you and the food, and then leave with you captive. But Elisha knows that his war is not with the Syrians. Elisha knows that it is a spiritual war with Satan. And he knows that the only way to win that war is by listening to God and following what he says. And so, in verse 23, we see he prepared for them a great feast, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. It changed them. They came with an agenda, and that was to capture Elisha. And they left without Elisha and without wanting to capture Elisha. We know that because it says, "And the Syrians did not come again on raids into the land of Israel." You see, these countries had been warring. This was not just a one-time fight. These countries were at war with each other. And after Elisha did this, the Syrians kind of took a step back. Because while they were only looking at the flesh and blood, they saw something they were not able to explain. Something that made no sense to them. And while we don't know that the Syrians ever came around to God, I mean, maybe some of them did, maybe some of them didn't. We weren't there however many thousand years ago that was. But we know that God won that fight without fighting. And so as we go through our days and we come across difficulties and we have these struggles and we see people who make us angry or people do stuff and we don't like it, I want us to realize that the fight is not with that person. The fight is with Satan. And if you're fighting anyone else, you're doing it wrong. And if you're using weapons of a worldly nature, you're doing it wrong. Elisha beat an entire army by feeding them and giving them water and letting them go free. I don't know many people that have won wars like that. Elisha is pretty much the only one that comes to mind. But I want us to really understand that Elisha was only able to do this because his eyes were open. Elisha didn't say, open our eyes. He said, open my servant's eyes. Because Elisha already saw what was going on. And I want to wrap up today by just pointing out how it's really easy to get distracted in this day and age. I mean, between technology and TV and all the crazy COVID that's going on and all the different stuff that's going on in the nation with the divides and the politics and the you name it. I mean, this year started off with us being on the verge of World War III, then Australia was on fire, then there were murder hornets, and then everything's on lockdown. Like, this has been a really crazy year. I was always told that the first year of your marriage would be hard. I did not know that they meant the world would shut down because of it. Just want to say. But that being said, all of these distractions are just in our way so that we don't see the bigger picture. Right? Satan has been around for a long time. He knows what he's doing. And he knows how to get our attention off of what really matters. And so I want to challenge us to really open our eyes and see the spiritual war that's going on around us. Because if we don't see it, then we cannot properly fight it. That's about all I got. I'm really bad at closing. One of these days, I will get better at it. I'm going to let Josh make his way up here. I'm assuming he has some kind of song or something. I'm going to go ahead and open for invitation. We'll close with a prayer, and then there will be a time for invitation. If I can have some of the elders or somebody come up here to take with people. I will also come down if anybody wants to talk with me or pray with me. But I want us to just take a moment to really spend some time in prayer with God and to ask Him to open our eyes to the spiritual war around us, to really help us understand that the fight we're fighting is not one that we can see, not without His help. So I ask that we just take a few moments to spend some time with God and to really look into, are we fighting this war like we should be? God, we just thank you for this day that you've given us today. I thank you for this congregation, this family that you've blessed me with. I ask that you help us as we go through the rest of this week, the rest of this year, into next year. And you just help us to see the war that we're fighting, that you help us to fight it your way and not our way. In your name we pray. Amen. It's on you.
So let's stand. Let's just sing the chorus of How Great Is Our God and proclaim that as we leave today. And how great is our God, oh sing with me, how great is our God, oh we'll sing how great, and how great is our God. Let's do that again. And how great is our God, oh sing with me, how great is our God, oh we'll sing how great, and how great is our God. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, and how great thou art, and how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, and how great thou art, how great thou art. Y'all dismissed. Have a good day.